Amara sat quietly at the long table, surrounded by the wealthy family of her husband in Abadan. The room was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and proud conversations about business and wealth. Yet, she felt like an outsider, her silence heavy against the noise. She kept her hands folded on her lap, her eyes lowered, hoping no one would notice her discomfort. But her husband, Chaik, did notice, and instead of protecting her, he turned her into a target. With a mocking laugh, he called her a burden, saying she brought nothing to the family. His words cut through the air like a knife, and all eyes turned toward her. The table grew quiet, but not out of respect. Some cousins exchanged knowing looks, a few uncles smirked, and scattered laughter broke out, fueling Chaik's pride. Amara felt her chest tighten as the humiliation washed over her. She lowered her eyes further, hiding the tears that threatened to spill, while Chaik leaned back with a satisfied smirk, enjoying the cruel attention he had gathered. Just as she thought the night could not get worse, a sharp sound echoed through the room. Mama Adiz, Chaik's mother, slammed her hand on the table, silencing everyone. Her eyes burned with fire as she looked around, daring anyone to laugh again. In that heavy silence, she revealed a truth that no one expected. Her voice was steady as she spoke about Amara, the quiet woman they mocked. She told them how Amara had secretly paid debts when the family was close to losing everything, how she had used her own savings to fund projects that others claimed as their success, and how she had quietly kept the family's estate from collapsing. Each word turned the smirks into shame, each revelation shifting the balance of power in the room. The proud relatives who once laughed now avoided her gaze, realizing the weight of their ignorance. Chaik's face drained of confidence as whispers filled the table. The truth was out, and the family saw clearly who the real burden was. For the first time, Amara lifted her head, her eyes no longer filled with shame but with strength. Her voice, calm yet firm, carried across the room as she reclaimed her dignity. The family, once cold, now reached out to embrace her, while Chaik sat exposed, his arrogance stripped away. That night, Amara no longer felt like an outsider. She left the table not as the quiet woman who endured, but as the one everyone now respected, while her husband carried the weight of disgrace. Her husband, Chaik, raised his voice loud enough for everyone at the dinner table to hear. With a mocking smile, he called Amara a burden, saying she brought nothing of value into the family. His words cut through the laughter and conversations, leaving the air heavy and sharp. The sound of glasses clinking stopped, and every pair of eyes turned toward Amara. Chaik leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention, as if his cruel words were a joke to entertain the others. Amara froze, her heart pounding, the sting of humiliation crawling over her skin. She wanted to disappear, to escape the shame burning inside her. The room fell into an uneasy silence, but not everyone stayed quiet out of sympathy. Some cousins smirked as if agreeing with him, and a few uncles exchanged sly glances, their lips curling into cruel smiles. Even the servants who moved around with trays slowed down, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Chaik noticed the scattered laughter, and it only fueled him more. His voice grew louder, filled with arrogance, as he repeated that she was nothing but a weight dragging the family down. He wanted everyone to see her weakness, to laugh at her pain. Amara lowered her eyes, refusing to let her tears fall in front of them. She clasped her hands tightly on her lap, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to keep her composure. Her silence was his victory, and Chaik smirked, raising his glass as if he had just proven something important. The family's wealth and pride surrounded her, yet she sat there feeling stripped of her worth, her dignity attacked in the cruelest way. Each second felt longer than the last, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. But beneath the quiet surface, something began to stir. The silence that followed his insult was not only filled with shame, but also with tension that even Chaik did not notice. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some realizing he had gone too far, while others watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Amara, though hurt, sat with quiet strength, holding her pain like a shield. Chaik thought he had broken her, but he had only planted the seed for what was to come. A moment that would soon turn the entire table against him and remind everyone that the woman he mocked was far more powerful than he ever imagined. Cousins and uncles exchanged uncomfortable glances, their eyes darting from Chaik to Amara as if unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. A few could not hold back and let out soft chuckles. their laughter echoing in the silence that filled the grand dining hall. The sharp insult still hung in the air, and while some shifted uneasily in their seats, others found amusement in Amara's humiliation. The clinking of cutlery had stopped, the chatter that once filled the room had died, and now only the sound of suppressed laughter lingered. Amara sat still, her chest tight, her face burning under the weight of their stares. She could feel the judgment pressing against her, the mocking glances cutting deeper than words. Every laugh was like another slap, reminding her that she was alone in this battle. Some family members avoided her eyes completely, pretending to be focused on their food, unwilling to show support. Others whispered behind their hands, their words too low to hear, but their smirks told her everything she needed to know. The moment was meant to shame her, and it was working. Chaik leaned back proudly, his smirk growing wider as he watched his relatives' reactions. He had turned her into the evening's entertainment, and he was satisfied with the attention he had drawn. The silence in the room was not the kind that comforted. It was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and cruel enjoyment. Amara's hands trembled slightly on her lap, but she forced herself not to wipe away the tears threatening to escape. If she cried, it would give them more reason to laugh. The long table, once filled with cheer and celebration, now felt like a stage, and she was the unwilling performer. Every second dragged on, her heart beating louder in her ears than the voices around her. But while humiliation washed over her, she also sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Not everyone laughed. Some faces showed guilt, others discomfort, and a few looked at Chaik with quiet disapproval. The uneasiness was growing stronger, and the weight of his words began to settle on the family. What started as a cruel joke was quickly turning into something deeper, something that would soon explode and change the evening forever. The humiliation weighed heavy on Amara as she lowered her eyes, refusing to let her tears fall in front of them. Her chest tightened with pain, but she stayed silent, trying to hold herself together. The mocking words of her husband still echoed in her mind, and she felt the sting of every laugh that had followed. She gripped her fingers tightly under the table, her knuckles stiff, while the air around her grew heavier with judgment. Across from her, Chaik sat with a smug smile, leaning back in his chair as if he had just won a game. His smirk grew wider with every second of her silence, enjoying how powerless she appeared. The guests watched her closely, some whispering quietly, others hiding small grins, as if her pain was nothing more than a spectacle for their amusement. The proud family that once claimed to value respect and unity, now let her sit in shame without a single voice raised to defend her. Amara felt the weight of their eyes pressing down on her, each glance cutting into her dignity. She wanted to vanish, to run out of the room, but her pride held her in place. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Chaik raised his glass, sipping slowly, as though her humiliation was a toast to his victory. The silence that followed was filled with his arrogance, and every second stretched painfully long. Amara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing, but she forced her face to remain calm. She sat still, even as her tears burned behind her eyes. Her husband believed he had crushed her spirit, and the family believed her silence was weakness, but deep inside, she was holding back a storm. The grand dining hall, with its glowing lights and golden plates, no longer felt warm or welcoming. Instead, it became a stage where her pain was displayed and her husband played the cruel star. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form in the moment. Not everyone was entertained by his cruelty. Some shifted uncomfortably, their smiles fading, their eyes no longer on her, but on Chaik's growing pride. The humiliation was sharp, but it was also the spark that would soon turn against him, changing the entire dinner in a way no one expected. Suddenly, Mama Adiz slammed her hand on the table, and the sharp sound echoed through the hall, making every head turn. The laughter stopped at once, the whispers froze, and the entire room fell into silence. Even Chaik, who had been smirking with pride, shifted uncomfortably, surprised by the sudden interruption. The glow of arrogance on his face dimmed as his mother's fiery eyes locked on him. Her presence was commanding, and no one dared to speak when she rose slightly from her chair, her hand still firm on the polished wood. The family, who had moments ago found amusement in Amara's humiliation, now sat in tense silence. Cousins who had laughed looked down at their plates, and uncles who had exchanged sly glances leaned back uneasily. The air was thick, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. Mama Adi's voice, strong and unwavering, cut through the stillness. She demanded that everyone stop mocking Amara, her tone leaving no space for argument. Her eyes swept across the table, and every person who met her gaze quickly looked away. Chaik tried to force a smile, as if to dismiss the scene, but his mother's stern look silenced even him. She reminded them all that respect was the foundation of their family, and anyone who mocked another had already lowered themselves. Her words carried weight, and the room shifted uneasily under the truth in them. Amara lifted her eyes slowly, shocked that the very woman she thought might never defend her was now standing like a shield before her. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer filled with shame directed at Amara, but with discomfort aimed at those who had laughed. Even the servants, still holding trays, stood frozen, their faces reflecting the tension. Mama Adi's voice grew sharper as she spoke again, this time turning directly to Chaik. The man who had humiliated his wife only moments ago now looked small under his mother's piercing stare. For the first time that evening, the attention was no longer on Amara's silence, but on Chaik's arrogance. What had begun as his moment of pride was now slipping away, and the power in the room was no longer his to control. She reveals a hidden truth about Amara that nobody at the table knew, and her words changed the entire mood in an instant. Mama Adi's voice was calm but powerful as she began to speak. She told the family that the woman they mocked as useless was the very reason they were still sitting in wealth and comfort today. The room grew heavy with silence as her words sank in, and every eye turned toward her with disbelief. Chaik's smirk faded, confusion clouding his face as he tried to understand what his mother meant. She continued, explaining that when the family had been drowning in debt and close to losing everything, it was Amara who had quietly stepped in. Without seeking praise, she had used her own savings to cover debts that would have destroyed the family's reputation. She had taken money meant for herself and invested it into projects that later became the pride of the family name. Every success they celebrated, every property they showed off, every business they claimed as their strength, all of it stood today because of Amara's sacrifices. The shocked faces around the table told the story clearly. Uncles who had laughed now looked ashamed, cousins who had whispered now lowered their heads, and even the servants paused, realizing they had been watching the wrong person with judgment. The woman they had pitied or mocked was the one who had carried the family's burdens without a word. Mama Adi's voice did not shake as she made it clear. Without Amara, the family's wealth and pride would have collapsed long ago. Amara sat still, her eyes wide, unable to believe that the secret she had kept hidden was now laid bare in front of everyone. The silence that followed was no longer filled with mockery but with guilt and shock. Every face turned toward her, not with scorn, but with respect that grew heavier by the second. Chaik's face burned with embarrassment as the attention shifted completely. The table that once laughed at her now leaned toward her with awe, realizing she was not the burden but the strength that kept them standing. In that moment, the power in the room changed, and everyone knew the truth could never be hidden again. The backstory poured out as Mama Adi spoke, her voice steady and filled with truth. She narrated how Amara, the quiet woman everyone looked down on, had carried the family's weight in silence. When debts piled up and creditors threatened to take away properties, it was Amara who stepped forward without telling anyone. She used her own savings, money she had carefully kept aside, to clear the debts that would have ruined their name. While others boasted of power and wealth, she worked in silence, making sure the family's reputation never fell. Mama's words painted a picture of hidden sacrifice. She explained how Amara had funded projects that many at the table now proudly claimed as their success. Businesses that were celebrated as family achievements had been saved from collapse by Amara's quiet contributions. She never demanded credit, never spoke of what she had given up, and never asked for recognition. Instead, she watched as others received applause, all the while knowing that their success rested on her shoulders. The estate they sat in, shining with wealth and pride, had once been at risk of being lost forever. Few at the table even knew how close they had come to losing it all. But Mama revealed that Amara had stepped in once again, securing the estate and making sure the family did not face disgrace. Every corner of their wealth, every comfort they enjoyed, had traces of her sacrifice hidden within it. She was the silent protector who chose dignity over attention, love over pride, and family over herself. The room was frozen, the guests stunned into silence as the truth settled over them. Cousins who had laughed now looked down in shame. Uncles who had mocked shifted uneasily, and the weight of guilt pressed down on everyone. Amara sat still, overwhelmed that her secret sacrifices were being spoken out loud for the first time. The woman they had called a burden was the one who had carried them all, the one who had saved them from ruin. Mama Adi's voice shook slightly at the end, not from weakness but from pride. She declared that the family owed everything they had to Amara, and no one could ever deny it again. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy with respect. The tables turn as the family begins to see Chike clearly, and their eyes no longer look at Amara with judgment but at him with disappointment. The proud smirk he once wore slowly faded as silence turned heavy around the table. Whispers started low, uncles leaning into each other, cousins shaking their heads, their glances sharp with disapproval. It was no longer Amara they saw as the problem. It was the man who had mocked her. Chike shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping, as the weight of their stares pressed down on him. Mama Adi's words had cut deep, and now the truth could not be hidden. The cousins who had laughed earlier now muttered that it was shameful for a man to insult the very woman who had carried the family in silence. The uncles who once smirked now pointed out that Chike himself had never contributed as much as he claimed. Every business he bragged about was tied back to the sacrifices Amara had made. One by one, the relatives began to voice their thoughts, and each word turned against him. The pride he carried was torn apart piece by piece, exposed under the weight of truth. Amara sat quietly, still stunned, as the anger of the family shifted to her husband. The guests who had mocked her now spoke in her defense, saying they had misjudged her all along. Their words grew louder, and Chike's face flushed red as he struggled to defend himself. But every time he opened his mouth, another voice rose to remind him of his failures. The man who had stood tall with arrogance was now small under the storm of judgment. The atmosphere at the table had completely changed. Where Amara had once been the target, she was now the woman everyone respected. Where Chike had once enjoyed applause, he now faced condemnation. The realization hit the family hard, that the true burden was not Amara but the man who belittled her. His pride had blinded him, and now it was stripped away in front of everyone. For the first time, Amara did not feel alone at that table. The family that had laughed at her humiliation now stood united against him, and Chike sat exposed, his arrogance turned into shame that he could no longer hide. The empowerment came when Amara finally lifted her head and spoke, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the tense silence. For so long she had been quiet, carrying burdens no one knew, but now she was no longer afraid. Every eye turned toward her, waiting to hear the words of the woman they had once dismissed. Her hands no longer trembled, her tears no longer held her back. With calm strength, she looked around the table and spoke of dignity, respect, and truth. She told them she had never wanted recognition or praise, only unity in the family. She explained how every sacrifice she made was not for glory but for love, yet she had been insulted and mocked as if she had done nothing. Her words were not angry, but they carried weight, and each sentence pierced the hearts of those who had laughed at her. The cousins who once chuckled now lowered their heads, ashamed to meet her gaze. Even the uncles who had mocked her shifted uneasily, knowing her voice carried more honor than their pride ever could. Amara's eyes turned to Chike, and her voice grew firmer. She told him that his words had cut deep, but they no longer had the power to break her. She reminded him that respect in a marriage was not a gift to be earned with wealth, but a foundation to be protected with love. Chike's face flushed, his arrogance crumbling as the truth poured out in front of the very people he had wanted to impress. For the first time, he had no clever response, no mocking laugh, only silence. The family watched in awe as the woman they had once ignored stood tall before them. Amara's calm strength filled the room, shifting the energy completely. She had been humiliated, but she rose from it stronger, her dignity shining brighter than their wealth and titles. Her voice reminded them all that true power was not in pride or arrogance, but in quiet strength and sacrifice. When she finished, the room was silent. Not with judgment, but with respect. She had reclaimed her place, not as a burden, but as the heart of the family, and no one could ever take that away again. The aftermath was unlike anything Amara had imagined. The same family that once sat in silence during her humiliation now turned toward her with open arms. Aunts leaned forward to apologize, cousins reached out to hold her hands, and uncles who had once laughed now spoke with shame in their voices. They embraced her, not just with words, but with the respect that had been missing all along. Their eyes no longer saw her as an outsider, but as the woman who had carried them when they didn't even realize it. The weight of truth had opened their eyes, and in that moment, Amara finally felt seen. Chaik sat apart, his face pale and his pride shattered. The smirk that had once decorated his lips was gone, replaced by the heavy silence of shame. He tried to speak, but no one listened. Every glance toward him was filled with disappointment. The relatives who once cheered his arrogance now looked at him with disapproval, and the authority he thought he held had crumbled completely. He had wanted the spotlight, but now it burned against him, exposing his flaws to everyone. Amara, for the first time that evening, smiled softly. The dignity she had fought to protect was now shining brighter than ever. She had not needed to shout or beg for recognition. The truth had spoken for her. The family that once turned their backs on her now gathered around her, lifting her spirit higher than their wealth could ever reach. The woman who entered the room quietly and unsure left with her head held high, her strength undeniable. Chaik's shame lingered in the air, but Amara no longer carried the pain of his words. The family had finally seen the truth, and nothing could erase it. What was once a night of humiliation became a night of victory, a turning point that would never be forgotten. Amara's silence had been her strength, and now her courage was her crown. Hi, besties Cherry Blossom, thank you so much for staying with me until the end. Sparkling Heart, please don't forget to like, thumbs up, drop a comment, speech balloon, and hit that subscribe button bell, so you never miss another story. See you next time, bye. Waving hand.